Okay, cool. Then I'm going to go ahead and start this. Okay. So hello to everyone and welcome to C Conversation series for the monsoon semester. It's called Drawing Worlds. And C Conversations is a part of C City, which is the school's cultural outreach program, and it is also supported by the Urban Center Mumbai. So every term, actually, we have a new question around which we curate the series. And this time we're engaging with the question of drawing. I'm going to introduce it very quickly because we spoke of it at some length 2 weeks ago. But what we hope to do with the series is essentially open up conversations about the many forms that drawings take that come from different ways of seeing and how these forms essentially open up newer ways for us to consider our spaces and our environments. And in the case of Afra, the stories that make them. And we started this conversation series on the 5th of July with Rohini Devashar, and I'm so glad to have with us for our second talk of the series, Afra Shafiq. And for everyone from Mumbai, I hope you were able to see her work at the NMACC. It was at the show called Liminal Gaps, and I think it ended in June, but it was on for quite a few months before that. Anyway, I'll just introduce Afra formally. I have her. Yeah. So Afra Shafiq is a multidisciplinary artist based in Goa in India, and her work takes hybrid forms that bring together text, sound, animation, code, and sculpture to create interactive, sometimes simulated atmospheres to experience and unlearn. And she often seeks ways to retain the tactile within the digital and the poetry within technology. And her work has been included at the Dhaka Art Summit in Bangladesh, the Video Art Pavilion at the Asian Art Biennale, World Building, Gaming and Art in the Digital Age, which was curated by Hans Ulrich Obrist at the Julia Stoschek Foundation, Düsseldorf, and Center Pompidou, Metz. Very Small Feelings at the Kiran Nadar Museum of Art, New Delhi. Among many other exhibitions in India and globally. And Afra, thank you so much for being a part of this. I'm going to invite you to speak now. And in the meantime, I'll keep my presentation, my video off. In case any of you have any questions, please type them out in the chat box. We'll get to them afterwards. If you're on YouTube, you can type in the questions there as well. And yeah, we'll see you. Afra, thanks. And I invite you to show your work.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Apurva, and for kind of nudging me to talk about drawing, because after we last spoke, I don't know, I think my initial reaction was like, I don't think I really have a relationship to drawing, and I don't think drawing is a very core part of my practice. But then obviously, since we chatted about, like really exploring the meanings of drawing, I think it was quite nice for me to also do this exercise of reflecting and kind of trying to think about what that means for me. So yeah, there's just a lot of meandering thoughts that I had that I'm kind of going to share, along with examples of some projects that maybe help make sense of those ideas. But just to kind of set a little bit of a context of the kind of work that I do and on what my practice is like. I mean, I think also one of the reasons why I immediately like jumped to this, but I don't draw, I don't have this kind of practice, is because I haven't really been to art school and I didn't really enter this world of contemporary art making with a lot of intentionality. It kind of was accidental, doing one thing after the other, and then I kind of landed up here. But what I basically come from is a more sort of writing and research-based practice, and I was kind of interested in documentary filmmaking, and that's also what my training has been in. And over time, I think that my practice still has its core in documentary form, but it kind of tries to explore different ways of entering that research or entering my kind of lengthy research phases with the archives, which is something I've been quite interested in a recurring way. And I kind of began to think about what does working with archives have to do with drawing, because that is my primary like modus operandi. I often work with archival material and I spend kind of long phases of research, and many times I kind of enter a collection or a research phase without really already deciding this is what I'm looking for or this is what I'm planning to make, but I kind of allow for that to emerge through the process. And I think that process is something that I wanted to share today, to really think about the metaphor of drawing in terms of archival research. So I'm just gonna share some material that might make it a bit easier. Yeah, so basically in today's talk, I kind of wanted to talk about two kinds of ideas, but really the idea of pattern making as a form of drawing and how that kind of could translate in a literal way as well as in a metaphorical way through two different aspects of my practice. And the first sort of part is this act of, or this process that sort of I think I end up relying on when I'm working with archival material, and it's the act of drawing from, where you're kind of working with material that's research led, but you're kind of arriving at what you want to say as well as the ways in which you want to end up saying it, by really engaging with the material in a sense of looking for patterns, tracing or observing or detecting things in the material that speak to you, and then letting the work form from there. So with this sort of, process in mind, I wanted to share one particular project that I worked on in 2017. It was this a research residency that I was doing with the Liverpool Biennial, and it was kind of an open-ended invitation to work with some, like a series of archives in the north of England. So in Manchester, Liverpool, Salford, Burnley, and like a couple of these other smaller collections, libraries, state-run institutions in the north. And I really wasn't sure what I would end up doing, but I kind of knew I wanted to look at images of women in those archives and sort of see where it goes. And I was interested in domestic life, and that's kind of like women's domestic lives and labor has kind of been an interesting, like an area of interest for me. So I knew that that was a broad spectrum zone I was interested in, but I went in very open-ended and I kept looking at different material in the archives. And one of the kind of images that I started feeling quite attracted to were these images of women sewing, or basically doing something with thread and their hands within the home. So sometimes they would be sewing, or here, like whatever, making the thread, or knitting or mending or embroidery or whatever, but something to do with thread and themselves inside the house. Kind of started feeling like a pattern that I observed everywhere, and felt quite drawn to. And I sort of started putting together this material to see what it could tell me. And so as I started looking at a really large collection of this material, you kind of start seeing certain things in it that speak to you, in the sense of, like, one of the things that I found really like compelling is the body language across all of the imagery, where there was a particular, like, chin bent and all the attention sort of focused on this object in their hand, and a sort of detachment from the physical surroundings. Also felt like it was quite a varied age groups. You'd see images of really young girls as well as a lot of older women doing this activity. It also kind of ran across class, like you would see a lot of aristocratic women sewing or embroidering or whatever, but you would also see what seemed like quite working class households, and then the women there also doing the same thing. And then I also felt like it record a lot in terms of, like, period, from when the images were made, because of also, like, the kinds of mediums in which they were made. And so I just kind of got quite interested in this imagery, and it sort of started making me think about this form of, like, recreation, leisure that women did within the home. And often it's kind of what they would do in their free time. And how, like, this idea of productivity within leisure in women's lives, but also the sort of almost mechanical quality to the activity, in terms of the repetitiveness of sewing, where you have, like, a stitch after stitch, or a knitting, and this sort of activity, how it kind of becomes, like, I mean, I don't know if many of you listening have a relationship to this, but maybe there's like a person in an older generation in your family who you see who does like a lot of sewing or knitting, or if you are people who practice it, you know that after a point of doing it repeatedly for a long enough time, it becomes almost second nature to your body. And I was thinking about how, the body almost becomes mechanical, and then there's all of this space for the mind. And I was just sort of wondering about the travel of the mind for all of these hours that perhaps end up happening during these sort of time periods with these women. So this is just like more examples of that imagery. But really look like in the context of, oops, sorry. Gosh. Sorry, maybe I should just quit my WhatsApp from my computer. 1 second. Okay, done. Oh my gosh. Sorry, can you hear me and see me? Okay, I mean, see the presentation?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
So yeah, so I was just kind of looking at these imagery of the sewing and kind of got interested in exploring that a bit more. And then as a sort of next step, what I did was to kind of try and look at what it is that women were sewing, or look at the objects or the artifacts that they were sewing. So for example, this is like one sort of collection that was in one of the museums that I was looking at, called samplers, which are basically these sort of cross-stitch things that they start making quite young. So like, and they usually sign it with their name and age and date. And like in this one, for example, you see it's like an 11-year-old who's made this, and it's sort of your training ground before you kind of do more ambitious projects. So sometimes it would just be the alphabet, or like very similar, I mean, very sort of simple cross-stitch motifs. But it also kind of struck me that like for 11-year-old to sit down for so long and do it is sort of a training for the body and the mind to be sort of engaged in a certain kind of activity, but also training the cognitive mind to think in a sort of numerical pattern-based format. Because so much of cross stitch, much like pixel drawings or like dot per matrix grids, like it's quite numerical. You need to count a lot, and like to kind of transform imagery or like transfer imagery, you kind of need to have some sort of a count pattern logic that keeps going. So for an 11-year-old to work on something like this, I felt like it was an early sort of training or sharpening of that pattern making mind. And then I started looking at other imagery of women in the archives, and especially because this was set in Manchester and Salford, the research, a lot of the archives had a lot of material around, because it was a cotton I mean, it has histories of cotton mills and cotton manufacturing. And I think that was one of the first workforces that women entered into when they, got into public life and began to work for the first time, etc. And they were kind of often employed by the mills to operate the machines that were designated for pattern making. So they would be called pattern girls, and they're quite young, and they would like, so there's some of this sort of imagery of the girls where this sort of logic of pattern making already was something that wasn't new to them. But now how do you translate the logic of the pattern in your mind to a machine sort of understanding it? So then really thinking about the pattern numerically and in a grid logic. And so after a point, like there were all these memoirs of quite young girls working as pattern girls, how they would look at a flower and they would be able to write a numerical code of how to translate that flower into the machine. And so it's like really early computing being done through the minds of these like young women looking at patterns. And then sort of the other thing that I was looking at is women's publishing. So books, journals, other things that were published by women. And I mean, a lot of them had, these sort of like patterns for knitting or patterns for like crochet or whatever. And it kind of, at that point, I actually didn't even know how to knit or do crochet or any of this. So it was like complete, like another language for me altogether. But I found it so complicated and so like, I don't know, almost like daunting. And it seems to be perceived as a most like simple and like kind of cute time pass thing that women do. But actually, it has a lot of like complex thinking to it. And the other thing that you see on the extreme right is again this like really interesting book that I kind of found in the archives of typists. Like that was another one of the first jobs that women did in the workforce, working as like secretaries and typing, or like typists or whatever. And in this magazine was amazing because they wrote the whole magazine pretty much in shorthand. And if you look at shorthand itself, which is like such a kind of complex codified sort of way of, creating language. And so I was kind of looking and thinking about all of these different things, starting with the sewing to like the back end processes of making those things that they were kind of sitting there and making. And this kind of like idea, and of course, parallel to this, I was reading a lot of published, but also a lot of unpublished writings by women, letters or diary entries and stuff like this about about like what their experiences were like or what their relationships were like to these activities. And I felt like so much of it wasn't already apparent in the perception of what, just looking at the images of these women in the interiors or in their domestic spaces. And so this sort of thought just kept coming to me, like it seems so codified, or it seems like it has this relationship to code, not only in the way that it's perceived, but also in the way in which it isn't perceived from the outside. And then, of course, so this is like the binary logic of a weave. And I kind of started thinking about how Ada Lovelace, who kind of wrote the first program for Babbage's difference engine, was kind of inspired by the Jacquard loom and this sort of connection between weaving and coding, and like were women the first people who kind of wrote programs and codes, and do we have a computational way of thinking because of all these years of kind of engaging in these certain kinds of activities that were related to the thread. And so I really wanted to find a way in which these multiple sort of points of entry or access to all of these findings within the archive could sort of be accessed and understood. And so I kind of came back to the pattern to kind of make the work. So what you see on the left is what the work looks like. So it's just like, it's a patchwork, or like how a patchwork tapestry is often made, but it's in the form of a QR code. It's about 5.5 feet. But if you go really close, so the screenshot on the right is, oops. Oh, yeah, the screenshot on the right is like a small close up of what you see. So from far, these little beige pixels that you see, if you go close into them, they're actually images of women indoors performing different kinds of labor. So sweeping, cleaning, cooking, mending, whatever. And then you have these little, like these 4 little window monitor kind of things that on different timings, the QR code sort of comes alive, and you can it's this like video, this 4-channel sort of video piece, but it uses the protagonist of one of the cross-stitch characters, and the kind of thought being like a woman sort of sewing, and the character on her embroidery comes alive and goes on this almost like a Super Mario like adventure. Kind of also drawing this parallel to like early pixel graphics and cross-stitch embroideries, but also this idea of code being embedded into the whole piece, where you can scan this patchwork as one QR, but also like here you will see there's one tiny QR code in the right. So like this, there are about 25 different QR codes that are hidden or like embedded into this patchwork that can also be scanned. And each of them leads to what I call a digital handkerchief. So it's like a small hanky that has like one little story or excerpt or moment of one woman's testimony that was kind of found in the archive. So it kind of helps you sort of decode all of these lives in some way. And then this is like a tiny excerpt of one of the videos. And so like lots of different things happen in the videos. This is one particular section which is about women that were working on the dress reform movement and kind of trying to abolish the wearing of corsets and crinolines. But basically, this is what the 4-channel, like the video piece inside the code looks like. So it's all like scans and cutouts of the lace making and the embroidery and like all the different things that women made that I kind of photographed in the archive. And then this is kind of what the digital hankies look like. So when you scan on your phone, like these are the kind of, all of them have these little stories inside them that you can kind of scan and see. And some of them are literally to do with the idea of code, and some of them are just to do with their experiences of sewing or living inside the house for X number of hours, or working with the idea of or how the idea of pattern making sort of comes into their lives. So yeah, so this is sort of that project that I thought would be interesting to think about or talk about for this talk, with sort of the idea of how, I guess, like I find it a bit comforting now, like after a few years of like following this process, about how you I would never be able to arrive at a work like this in advance. Like there is no way that I could have one day woken up and be like, I want to make this QR code which has this XXX, because it is really like the one thing leading to the other, and sort of drawing a parallel or drawing a pattern or sort of looking at connections or experiencing the material that sort of led me to make the work that it ended up making. And I feel like that act of, allowing things to emerge from the material has kind of become like the exciting part of my practice for me, which involves often the act of not knowing when you sort of enter a project, and kind of allowing yourself to be more positively anticipatory about it. And I think the fact that that led to work that still had a relationship to patterns somehow was interesting to me. But this is still like literally the second work that I'd ever made. So I don't think, I mean, even now, I'm not sure, but I do think like now retrospectively, I do feel like there is some sort of relationship that every project of mine ends up having to the grid and to pattern making, which I don't think I was like aware of then. And I don't know if this is something that needs to continue or why it exists or whatever, but it's something that I'm also like, as I'm sharing with you, I'm also kind of observing for myself logic. So yeah, so the other sort of idea that I wanted to talk about was not the idea of like drawing from, but like drawing with, or like making with patterns. So for that, I wanted to share a few other projects, and I'll kind of do it in a little bit more brevity than the previous one. So this is a project that I made. I was kind of researching about these Soviet children's books that used to be really popular in India during the Cold War. And they're these like gorgeously illustrated, like beautiful children's stories in all these different Indian languages. And while I was kind of working on that project, and of course, like there's, lots of beautiful merits about the material and that moment in time, but also very aware of the fact that it was sort of it was a friendship between two nations, and a sort of more like it was an Indo-Soviet friendship pact that had a cultural exchange policy that led to the arrival of these books, and sort of looking at it also through that lens, where like what were the ideas that were being exported by this nation to our nation, and what were the sort of ideas of an ideal form of governance or an ideal citizen that was sort of being inculcated in this almost like propaganda way to children's minds, because that was at the end of the day the point of the exercise. And so while I was sort of researching or like working on the project, I also sort of started thinking about like who were the authors whose works didn't make it, and on what basis were like what books were selected by whom and why. And so when I was kind of looking at that, I mean, I think this is like quite a famous Soviet poet. So some of you might already know of him, but I didn't know of him before this research project. But it's a Soviet poet who was sort of around in the 20s and 30s. I mean, he was most active in the 30s. He died in the mid 40s, but his name is Daniel Kams, and he's sort of a contemporary of Tchaikovsky and, Samuel Marshak and all these people whose books were very, very popular in India. And he's also a children's poet. But even though he did have quite popular children's books at the time in the Soviet Union, his books never made it to India, and I kind of got interested in his life because I read one of his poems for adults, and I was just completely blown away by it. And I kind of started reading up more about his life, and then I sort of figured how he basically like hated children, and he thought they were just like really annoying shits. And he kind of wrote for children because he wasn't able to publish his writing for adults, and he was broke, and it was just a way for him to sort of make money. And the writing for adult is like really his sort of artistic expression in some way. And when I started reading more and more about that, but also his own like philosophies behind his writings, some things really started sort of striking me. But one of the things that really like felt, intuitively like linked for me is I felt like what so basically what he does is he's sort of like an anti-Soviet poet. He's part of the dissident community of artists, and he kind of challenges lots of new ideas about the Bolshevik government. And he's also around and practicing around the peak of Stalinism, so there's heavy censorship and control. And so he starts sort of playing with form and how like what can you do to form to make it subversive, or to allow for form to say things that you wouldn't otherwise be able to get away with because of the level of control, like state control. And so he starts really thinking about the concept of nonsense, and how when you remove or you make a work devoid of sense, it could really contain within it everything and nothing. And he sort of plays with this idea of nonsense in this very like gorgeous way in his poetry. And I felt like the more I read his philosophies behind it, as well as like read his poetry, I felt like he was doing exactly what Malevich was doing with the visual form at around the same time, where Malevich sort of thinks about the 0 degree painting and comes back to like the black square and geometric form. And like in a time where like Soviet socialist realism is the state sanctioned aesthetic, he sort of has this seminal exhibition, which is what we're looking at an image of, which probably changed contemporary art in so many ways. And so I kind of really wanted to, and somehow that connection between both of them never maybe doesn't really exist in like scholarship or way of seeing. Obviously, also Daniel Kahneman's is not as well known. So I kind of wanted to really think about his works in a form of Malevich. And so what I did was kind of look at some of the forms of Malevich from this exhibition. And then one of the things that so there was a number of his, Daniel Kahneman maintained a journal quite like meticulously. So there were a series of excerpts from his journal that were being translated to English in a publication recently. I mean, while I was doing this research, I was able to kind of really read a lot of material. And one of the things that really struck me was that he didn't have a way to publish his writings. So he would go to friends' houses that had typewriters, and he would sort of type them out and distribute them by hand to other friends. And then eventually he sort of gets arrested because of various reasons, but he gets arrested 2 times. The third time he kind of pleads insanity and gets sent to the psychiatric ward. And then during the siege of Petrograd, they stop feeding the prisoners because there's a food shortage, and so he kind of dies in the psych ward. But so it has this really tragic sort of life circumstances. But I kind of happened to get access to his diary entries through what I mentioned. But also, like in one of the writings about his work, this logic of him like typing out his works and distributing it really struck with me. And so I felt like I wanted to kind of translate or redraw some of his writings into Malevich forms using the typewriter. So I kind of came up with this logic of the black, red, and white, which I thought also worked kind of beautifully for me because the typewriter has like a red and a black ink and a stencil mode. And I kind of started looking at all the blacks as his published, not published per se, but his, writings for the public, his poetic work. And the reds are excerpts from his diaries or journal entries. And then the whites because in the Malevich, the whites are not just the background, like they're intentionally whites. So then the whites I kind of started thinking of as his sort of state documents. So interrogation letters or minutes from his interrogation when he was in the psych ward, or like there were some early very scathing reviews of his work in the press that also led to his first court arrest, and then there's transcripts from his court hearings. So all of these official documents. So looking at all this three like textual material, we wanted to transform it or like redraw it using the typewriter into these Malevich forms. So I just want to share like a little bit that process of it, because at some level I knew like, okay, this is the form and then this is the text. And so like say this text goes with this idea of the white and the black or the red, and these things go together. But also then how does this form evolve with this particular text and this particular typewriter, which has a particular spacing and a font size and a girth and like whatever. So there was a lot of working with the grid and a lot of mathematics for me to figure out like what are the different angles or what size or what ratio of the whites to the black can one arrive at. And so then I did end up recreating Malevich's forms, but often the form itself would also like respond to the texts. For instance, like what is the angle of the circle, or what is the ratio of the triangle to the black, whatever, rectangle. And so I felt like at some level I was translating Malevich's works through Daniel Kams's writing, but Daniel Kams was also in some way like pushing Malevich's work to become something slightly different from what Malevich's original works were. And so this was sort of this process that I kind of followed. And then these are the images of the finished work. So here it's like a little bit of a close-up of, like a poetry. And then this is like a, in the background, like one of his interrogations or testimonies. And then also like really thinking about like what text works for what shape and what image kind of comes from what line. And so I feel like that drawing and text relationship was like something that I had never really tried before, like thinking of text as shape. And yeah, it was kind of like fun and frustrating, but really fun eventually. I'm working on this series of sort of drawing with the typewriter. And yeah, and then one other sort of work I'm just gonna go through a bit more, which is kind of still in relationship to drawing again, and like drawing with existing patterns. And this is a sort of a research project that I was again working on for the same show. And again was an extension of my relationship to the Soviet children's books. So it's the project I did after that one. And it was basically, I mean, I kind of encountered a lot of these illustrations of these red and white embroideries in the children's books, and I got quite interested in them. So I did like a separate research about this sort of folk embroidery form that was practiced in this East Slavic tradition. So in what's contemporary Ukraine and Belarus, some parts of Russia, etc. And this is sort of ritual embroidery, almost almost like a sacred sort of form that was traditionally practiced, often used in altar spaces or like for particular life moments, births, deaths, funerals, etc. Days of harvest, whatever. But I kind of got really interested in the motifs and really reading into the meanings behind the motifs and really looking at the patterns on the embroideries as if they are a kind of an early precursor to textual storytelling and what stories are sort of embedded within the embroideries. So these are some of the embroideries from the archive. And obviously there exists like a lot of scholarship around this. So I haven't done any primary research. I've kind of just read like journals and books and stuff like this for this project. And so this is the sort of form I was looking at. And then I started drawing out the patterns or like making my own dictionary of the patterns, almost as if like trying to interpret it as grammar. Like if I know that the embroideries have stories embedded within them or ideas embedded, but what is the alphabet of it? Or like, what is the way in which I can kind of see what they're saying? And they kind of became very, very apparent over time. So like you see the symbol of the earth and then you see the symbol of the sun, and literally the earth and the sun combined, has the symbol of life. Then you see the symbol of rain, and if you kind of add the symbol of rain to the earth and the sun, you get bread. So it was just really this way of like understanding what core elements meant and the rearrangements and arrangements of those. And then kind of also came across researchers or like ethnographers who had made lists of symbols, and I found the existence of some of these symbols really intriguing. Like, why did they have, or like the fact that the symbol existed, I felt told me so much about the lives of the women who were embroidering them, and what else can you kind of excavate in terms of their own like lives or relationships or states of mind just by looking at the meanings of the symbols. um and so I ended up making a game also from this, but I'm not going to get into that in today's talk. But this is one of the series of works that I made from that research. I started transcribing all the symbols that I came across in all these different places of the mother and child or the pregnant woman. So this is kind of that series, and I wanted to sort of see over time, like how not only as a symbol gets more sort of simplified, are we still able to see that as a motif? Does it feel, because no motif is simply decorative or randomly placed. They all sort of have, even though the meanings might have been lost over time, there are core reasons why, on a wedding day, this is what is embroidered, or on this day, this is what, because it's almost like a talismanic sort of property to it. So I started looking at the mother and the pregnant woman to kind of see, how it morphs over time and gets sort of simplified, but also like, uh, what does it tell us? So for example, the first one you see is like, so these are the embroideries that I ended up making from the drawings of the original symbols. So just like, sort of very base sort of cross stitch image making. And you kind of start seeing it quite clearly in the initial ones. You see this woman with the little creature on her belly. The second one is like 3 generations of grandmother, mother, and then inside that there's a child. Then there's like a mother and child, which is like, this is called the classic mother, the one on the extreme right. And but as you keep like kind of, so this is just a close up of the embroideries that I did. But if you kind of see the progression of this, the last embroidery in the series on the extreme right, that has also been cataloged as a mother and child in some places. And some other places it's cataloged as the son. And I found that quite interesting because also in this sort of Slavic culture, they don't refer to the son as a masculine uh, figure as it is in many other cultures, like in the folk stories, in the songs, the son is a female. And so I found it quite interesting, like what are the other ways of perception that one could tell simply by the mark makings of these embroideries. So there are a few other series that I've done with this. One more is around a birthing woman, where I mean I haven't put the images of it, but it's basically like a woman akimbo with a small sort of thing coming out of her, and so it's like this idea of arms and legs spread and like in a birthing position. But there's another symbol called the loose woman or the drunk woman, and she looks exactly like the birthing woman, except she doesn't have anything coming out of her vulva. So it's like the woman spread without anything coming out. Like if she spread without needing to birth, then she sort of looked at as a loose woman. So it's also like, looking at ways of like different sort of iconographies of gender through these patterns. This is another um, work that I did, part of the same research and the same series. So this is what is often embroidered on the wedding, for the wedding day. So you'll see this sort of deity in the middle, and then these 2 horses flanked on either side. Sometimes she's on the horse and the horse is facing in 2 opposite directions. Sometimes she's kind of holding the rein of 2 horses, or sometimes both the horses are like, sort of standing facing her or standing facing opposite directions. And so I started kind of looking a bit more, trying to understand a bit more about this embroidered pattern. And it's sort of it's like a fertility deity called Mokosh, which is sort of, recalled on the wedding day. And they were like, not, there's no, obviously there's no consensus on like, oh, this is the meaning of this pattern. And so for myself also, I began to sort of speculate what it is that could mean. And I started sort of thinking about this 2-headed horse as a sort of, I mean, like this iconography of a creature looking in 2 different directions, or like this thing of being torn apart between choices or between a past and a present, or like a maiden and a wife, and they sort of like split in the life that women sort of experience on the day of marriage, and marriage being that sort of crux moment before that division takes place, and then really thinking about the idea of mourning on a marriage and looking at wedding songs and how wedding songs often talk about this like mourning of a life that you have to leave behind, leaving behind, your family or your village or your own self identity, or what is no longer possible once you sort of enter that threshold of that married sort of role. And I sort of started thinking about mourning and crying on a wedding and what it is that dies when someone gets married, or when the bride gets married. So then I kind of translated that Mukosh into this sort of grid drawing. And these are little pieces of glass, and then made this mosaic that you see on the right. But also, like, I mean, obviously it's not an embroidery, but it's it's a glass mosaic, but it's also still like the image is still constructed in the same logic and movement of time of like stitch after piece after piece. And but I also started thinking a lot about the LED matrix while I was working on this, and how image making in pixel forms like sort of a clear progression. I mean, I've been kind of interested in dot matrices and cross stitch for some time now, and so I thought that this was a good project to kind of link the two together. So here there's a little sort of custom built LED screen that I made, and here there's a small story around tears on a wedding day that you kind of read as a loop in this mosaic. And then the one on the left is another motif. So it's the classic mother that we saw earlier in the embroideries. But instead of a woman, sorry, instead of a baby in her stomach, she has a void. It's called the woman with the void. So in this particular one, the LED is on, but it's not always on. When it's off, it's a black square. And that's what her motif looks like. It's a woman, it's just called Woman with the Void. And then there are these interviews, that the researchers have done with different women, asking them like, what is it? And they're not sure. Like some of them say it's, a barren woman or a woman who's unable to conceive. And some say like, no, there's a woman who has like no desire to conceive because she's complete in herself, and the void represents like the whole universe that's already within her. So this sort of beautiful speculative meaning of lack versus full in this icon of this woman with the void, and then the meaning of the void. So I kind of created again the same thing in a mosaic, and then the LED here has the sort of small speculation about the meaning of the void that runs in a loop on video inside it. And yeah, and then this is some of, I'm still kind of working on the series, so I'm making some more. And then this is really, I mean, I quite really like took to this motif somehow. It's called the Great Mother is the Tree of Life. So it's really like, I guess it's looked at as the source of knowledge, or this like grandmother earth, which is often said in many cultures, like the source of all, life and knowledge, or like whatever, Great Mother Earth. And sort of looking at the Tree of Life motif as merged with her motif. And I kind of started also thinking about the motherboard within that. So this is something I'm kind of still working on and exploring, but just some drawings and the references of those. Yeah, and should I stop there, or like I have, yeah, maybe I can just, I'll just like, I have like one more small thing to share, which is basically like over time, I've been thinking about how the grid is somehow finding its way, again and again into my work and in different ways. And I guess like often the association of the grid is more like a sort of scaffold or a like functional um like feature where, it's kind of used as a reference point to make other things rather than looking at the grid itself as the thing that needs to be made. But I think that the idea of like this idea of the generative possibility of a grid is quite interesting for me, and the like multiple ways in which it can kind of be broken down and taken apart and rearranged to create completely different things. So this is just like one project of mine that I've sort of been working on, the idea of the grid a bit, and it kind of comes from my relationship to the game Minecraft, where everything is sort of made in a voxel logic. So I'm not going to get too much into this project, but just the sculptural form of it, and how I'm kind of thinking about the grid and the pixel, but now in like a bit more built in 3D form for creating anthills. So really thinking about the anthill as a game object, what would an anthill look like if it was made within the logic of Minecraft? And then how do you bring that logic into the real world? So this is one of the anthills that was at Dhaka. And then this is a consecutive, like a later anthill that was made. Oh, it's a much smaller exhibition and an indoor one. And what kind of gets kind of fun and playful is that the material keeps changing. Like in Dhaka, we had more access to like people working on the project. There was also access to mud as a material. And here it's a museum called the Zeppelin Museum, and we thought it'd be interesting to work with canvas cloth, which was actually what was used for Zeppelins in their first models. So then we made this with fabric. And then this was another anthill that, I mean, these are work in progress images, but we kind of working with this architecture school that developed this form of clay bricks as part of their course module. And then we decided to build the anthill as part of the coursework. So then also really thinking about, how that material could lend itself to the voxel logic. And these are some pictures from that show. And yeah, I guess I'm going to stop here.
Thank you so much, Afra. That was wonderful. I enjoyed the whole talk and the whole presentation and all of your work so much. One of my first questions to you actually was going to be, about the process of bringing out patterns or making networks from the archive apparent. But I think that has essentially been the crux of the talk. I mean, all
Yeah.
those processes of like finding images, finding patterns within them, reading things like the body language, looking at forms of organization, and then and it's very, very important for us because very often the question that we're dealing with is the question of having field work and then trying to and conducting research and then actually giving a form to that fieldwork in order to produce a drawing. And how does the fieldwork actually lead to a drawing? And and I think that's what your work essentially did for us, is that you look at inherent and how does the question of pattern and how does the archive itself produce images that can be read and processed in order to produce a drawing. What I feel is that for you the archive is a means through which the drawing gets produced, but there's also this reversible relationship that it has where the drawing also becomes an archive in a sense, where whether you have the code and then all this whole collection of image spaces. So while the collection becomes a method and synthesizes the work also is essentially about the collection.
Yeah.
So among the many, many, many things that the drawing also is, what is that particular significance of the drawing as archive that is important to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, for me, when I kind of start researching or working with archives, it's, I mean, I don't know, I find it terribly exciting. Like every time I, find certain like new pieces of information or like you have a hunch about something and then it starts sort of emerging in the archive, it feels very exciting. And then I feel like I want to somehow recreate that process or that feeling on the research in the work itself, and so often the work becomes a way for a person to also follow the same journey that I did in the archive while I was encountering these ideas or making sense of these connections or whatever. So often the work itself is a sub collection or and that is sort of intentional. Like, so for example, the Soviet book project that I was like briefly mentioning, I kind of started by building an archive of these books. So I would just like travel to different places and photograph the books, and they were just so beautiful in themselves. And I felt like, okay, we need to like share this, but I didn't want to just make a website and upload the books. I was like, what is the home? Like, what is that architecture of an archive for stories? And like, how do you kind of navigate those stories in a way that's as delicious as the stories themselves? And so then I felt like maybe stories are a great way to contain stories. And so then I kind of wrote a story using a lot of the characters from the books and then embedded the books as hidden items in this sort of game format that as you kind of go through the story, you can find the original books within them. So there's very much this thought of like the work itself is the archive, or like a collection within a collection, or like, so for example, this other sort of project that I worked on, I had gone to research a completely different thing, but I got really distracted. Like this was in New Mexico, and I got kind of distracted by like all these different Mother Marys I would see everywhere, like in shops or in like names of streets, Our Lady of this, Our Lady of that. And this is around that time I just moved to Goa. And so it felt like so similar that there's some sort of Marian worship that's going on in both these places, but they're not that Roman Catholic, virginal white, like patient, eternally kind Mother Mary feeling. Like there's another feeling. And I kept trying to kind of find something around it, but I couldn't. So then I just started building this archive of something that I wish existed. So I feel like the work is, they are mini collections and they are sort of like little research pockets in themselves somehow, but the way to enter it is like less essay, more exploratory kind of feeling in some way.
Right, right. Another thing is, when you presented that first collection, that first archive of yours, where you have the women in their interior spaces, in their domestic
Yeah.
spaces, and they're sitting and they're sewing. And what struck me actually was like, this kind of quietness and
Yeah.
that's there in all of these images, in all of their spaces, actually.
Yeah.
And then you're talking about how it's the world of the mind and what that possibly opens up. And I just had to, because I played around so much with Sultana's reality that I feel that I have to bring it up in this work, because you have those collages over there, and you're doing this layering in which you're producing these new forms, and there's this meaning of how the woman is read and represented through the collage. So I'm just wondering, because there is such a leap there, and there's such a speculation which happens with how you're reading the space, the interior space and the domestic space of women in that story. So is there like a special, like what launched that special experiment as well for you?
Hmm. Yeah, I think even in Sultana's reality, um, I was in the CSSC archive, and I was again, I mean, both those projects were done like quite close to each other also. In fact, some like a curator saw Sultana's reality and invited me on the Liverpool residency saying, why don't you do something like this? So it was very like on the back of that project. And I did initially think that I would look at women and books also when I go to the like England end of the research, but then it felt so repetitive and it felt like there wasn't really anything new going on. And that's when I kind of got distracted by the sewing women. But in Sultana's reality also, like I feel like, yeah, the one of the obviously intentions was that, you have this archive which is full of imagery of women, but most of those images are not created by women themselves. And so there's this like far removed imagination of what women were like or what they like to do or how they live their lives. And I was like, what if I imagine autonomy within these images and make the women perform in whatever ways that they like? So the animating the image then becomes like a form of giving agency. And so what would they then do? And then I felt like it's kind of bullshit for me to also make up what they would do just because I am a woman. Like that, also doesn't kind of cut it. So then I kind of went back to like reading women's history and kind of looking at the lives of certain first generation women writers in the country, and then allowing those experiences to then make me reanimate the images. So, for example, there was a series of photographs in the Calcutta archives that I found, which is like one of the first set of studio photographs in the country. And there were these women who kind of, when you're sending your photo for Rishta, like to get married, potentially get married, they make you like pose in a studio. So it was like this genre of photographs, and these women were kind of standing with a book. And so this was like the first generation of women to be educated. And those photographs were sort of a signal of these like very Badalok families saying like, oh, we come from this kind of family where the girls know how to read, which was like a super new thing and was a way to kind of set a sort of class articulation. But it wasn't to say that they are demanding certain like uh, free prospects for the women, right? Like they weren't expected to do anything from that education. It was just sort of decorative in a sense, right? Like they would still just come to your house and get married and like have children or whatever. And so I kind of found this like writing by someone who kind of was made to pose in this, and the way in which she subtly like holds her body language in a way that she feels would make herself undesirable, like a smirk and a raise of an eyebrow that makes her feel like she would not be easy to tame. And this sense of autonomy or like rebellion comes to her from the act of reading, which itself is ironic because she's standing in that photo in order to get married with that book. And so I kind of started then reanimating these images where, the book is being flung about, or the poses are sort of being like recalibrated and whatever. And so I really feel like in that project, it was very much trying to reframe what the women were doing, not based on how they were imagined, but how they themselves lived. And that became the way to kind of frame it. And then with Stitch, it was a bit different. Stitch is the sewing women project. I feel like it was less, like I was more comfortable with this feeling, like this feeling that you're also describing, that I also like felt quite strongly there, this sort of sukoon feeling of like really going inward with the act or whatever they were doing, or this detachment from surroundings. So often in the videos you would see the women disappear from there, like the body no longer exists, so the mind sort of escapes that room. Like they might be in the factory and they're kind of working on something, and then the body sort of evaporates, and then it's kind of thinking about like where they go to, or how that act kind of takes them into another realm, and then the speculation sort of begins. So I feel like there were very different like starting points for like where the play happens with the material then.
Yeah, and I think that speculation was also like, it starts off with this imagination of where the mind wanders, and it's this imagination of behavior, but it also sort of led me to think about, like, this most private space where the women are being sequestered actually as the space of freedom, where you're
Yeah,
sort of confined, but you also aren't
not to
troubled by the
watch.
idea of being
Yeah,
watched or
yeah,
overheard. And then, what I was just thinking of what that might produce in terms of rethinking our spaces, because you consider these spaces as hybrid and fluid, and just sort of shake that register a little bit. So rather than the register of the poor woman or the lack, then you start seeing it in slightly
yeah.
more freeing ways. I also wanted to, like, because you mentioned the grid, just wanted to ask a little bit about, like, where the grid is essentially seen as limiting and producing spaces that get repeated very, very often. And
Mm.
it's considered like, like a very, very stable form. And the pattern
Yeah,
is a pattern
yeah,
because it
like
is
rigid.
predictable, because,
Yeah,
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 it repeats
totally.
itself. So
Yeah.
how do you feel that your translations produce these deviations and forms that that end up surprising you, using the stability and that the thing of the grid?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is often the ways in which the grid is sort of looked at, right? Like it's a sort of a truth in some way, right? And but like I think the grid has also been used in so many different ways and so many traditional forms. Like if you look at tessellations, or like Islamic sort of iconography and calligraphy and like whatever like pattern making, which is so reliant on like the mathematical pattern of the grid. And then yet there's this sort of idea of like, oh, perfection only belongs to God. So we need to like make a mistake in our pattern because we're not divine. But the
Who's
mistake is
that? Like, who says that? Where is it? Where
so
did
in a
you
lot
read
of
it?
like in a lot of Islamic sort of pattern making, so whether it's on the insides of the domes of mosques, or in like calligraphic borders for the Quran, which you see like tessellated star patterns or like other patterns that are quite geometric, there will intentionally be a mistake because it's not divine to make something perfect, even though you know how to do it because you've made it with the basis of the grid. But that mistake is also snuck in such a way that it's not always apparent to the eye of the viewer. And so then you have to search for that imperfection in some way. And I feel like that's a really beautiful and like philosophical way of kind of like having the grid and knowing how to work with perfection, but then also like puncturing holes in it. And I feel that these are like many ways in which it's kind of like, I mean, even if you look at computer graphics and this logic of generating, I don't know if you've ever played this game called, it's not a game, but it's called the game of life, where it's basically like a grid and you have this box and you kind of are allowed to set a system for it. So you can say like, it can only travel diagonal, and every time it meets another box, it has to change from black to white. Suppose that's the rule. You can set whatever rule, and then you say go, and the emergent patterns are infinity. Like they will, the machine can replicate patterns that would go on for like a next million years. So the possibilities of the grid are also, I feel like, a lot more expansive. For me, at least, I find there's a lot of like endless possibility sort of feeling within the logic of the grid. And even like something as like even with pattern making, something that's considered quite like depersonal, there will be certain patterns that exist in certain cultures only, and they tell you so much about the origins of those patterns. Like I've been looking at crochet a lot in Goa, and like there's something called the pineapple pattern. And it's so interesting when that pattern is introduced in the history of the pineapple with Goa. And so I feel like a lot of these sort of ideas of just like a filet crochet, for example, in Goa is just a grid where you color certain squares and certain squares are empty, and then that's the pattern, right? But they're also linked to so many like real-time events, for example, that happen and that influences the creation of those patterns. So I think it's like, for me at least, I feel it's quite a rich like thing to sort of enter and constantly play with.
Right. And also, I felt that, there's this in a lot of the work, actually, in almost all of the work, there's this sense of taking a story or an event or an image that is an icon that has settled in a certain way. And now that retelling now shifts something, and then, like the meaning of it is completely changed. So there is this stirring of the mud, and it's like, it's very playful, deliberate. So you rework the existing narratives, and it becomes a form of redrawing history. And I'm just adaptively using this Marguerite quote over here, where you're not barring, but you're adding to all remembrance of what you've seen and being always on the lookout for what has never been. So can you like elaborate on, the politics of redrawing in your drawing processes and in the ways in which they get read?
Yeah, I mean, this is really tricky, right? Because it's also a dangerous activity to kind of infer whatever. And we see it
Yeah.
happening all the time in like story making and storytelling, especially on the internet and with the advent of like deep fakes and like image doctoring and like whatever. So it is definitely a tricky ground. And I feel also like sometimes, oh, my subjective experiences, my politics, and the ways in which I perceive things is definitely making me draw certain connections that are then being presented as a story. And I mean, I can't claim objectivity. It doesn't really exist. It is very driven by, I guess, my own interpretations of the world. And I don't know, like, if this makes it any, I don't know if it makes it, or like one of the ways in which I sometimes try to counter it is like, and maybe this is why I also often like to include primary sources within the work. Like you will find, like say in Sultana's reality, for example, you have all this like masti happening in the front end, but then you can click and see these like notebooky things which have like, oh, this is a citation from here, and this is where this comes from, and this is the source of this, or this is where this comes from. And I somehow feel like maybe that makes me feel for myself as a practice also like a little bit more comfortable with making these narratives, because I feel like it's on the backs of these studies or on the basis of this sort of way of thinking. But I mean, definitely at the end of the day, that is a very, I don't know if if as an artist you're making something, you do end up making your own interpretation of that thing, and even if it's a historical thing, um, what I'm doing, I may find offensive when someone else is doing it to tell another like, or may feel uncomfortable by another narrative being strung by the same means. So, I mean, I completely like do think about that often. But I feel like uh, there isn't I don't present the work as if it's not a paper, it's a play. So it's like a mix of fantasy and fiction and reality, and they kind of all swirl together. And I do leave clues of how you can differentiate one from the other, but there is a sort of way in which they're all kind of freely intermingling in some way. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, like, because the work is speculative and is dealing with histories, and, there's this question of uncertainty actually that's there. And there's this question, there's so much of what if from, from where you begin, where you're considering all these histories and following all of those histories. And it's also, I feel like, because a lot of the work invites a reading, a lot of the work is interactive in that sense, that question of what if is at the heart of it. There are all these alternative possibilities, and it sets up a curiosity actually, and it becomes an invitation that is present in the drawing. So I just wanted to know, like, how do you make that what if or that speculation? How do you make it a way of seeing and a way of drawing? I
I
don't
think,
know if you answered this question
yeah,
already. I just had to.
I don't know if I know the answer to this. I think a lot of it is also like in the nazar of the viewer in some way. Like there is there this is the actually the first time, but maybe because of the space after NMACC, I did get some like feedback that people were offended by the project, and I was like, okay, that's interesting also, and that's fine. But I think that there is like it's a mix of my like way of framing, but also your way of seeing, and it takes both of those to kind of really get the like ras of it in some way.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, right. Okay. And for the last talk, when I was talking to Rohini, I was also looking into the work of Roger Caillois, and the only work of his that I had was familiar with for many, many years actually was this book called The Writing of Stones, where he's looking at the cross section of stones and uses them to speculate on human imagination. But he's apparently, I mean, not apparently, he's more well known for his book called Man, Play, and Games. And he has this conceptualization on the nature of play. And these are a series of points, actually, where he says that it is free or not obligatory, it is separate from the routine of life, it is uncertain. It is unproductive. It is governed by rules that suspend ordinary laws and behaviors, and it involves imagined realities that may be set against real life.
Mm.
And I was just wondering if for your work, because it has the question of play in it so much, or it draws from stories and reimagining all of that, are there, if you have any extensions to these rules of play or terms of engagement that you want to set up with the drawing?
Yeah. I mean, they're all really beautiful points around play. I mean, I think a lot of this like it's called the magic circle in ludic studies, where you invite someone, you draw them into the magic circle, which is when you begin the game or you enter the game world, and then there is a suspension of not only the rules or the properties of the way that things function, but also who you are. And I think that games often, like especially like I recently made a role playing game where you play as the character of a bride on your wedding day, and I feel like games also really help you do that, where you end up sort of personifying a character that you might never really experience in life, or like really think about the experiences of that character in life. And I think that's also like a nice sort of like possibility that play offers. I also think that like the kind of games that I'm interested in are very what like explorer sort of games, like in the sense the more you see, the more you know, or the more you search, the more you find. And I feel like those are really like interesting rabbit hole formats, where there is a way to encounter a work on one plane, and then there is like all of this extra excavation that you can do if you're interested to kind of enter it in different ways. And that for me makes it also um like I'm able to then torso like everything that I want to say and not worry about it becoming too much. But then there will always be some kind of people who like to nerd out, and then that becomes like an Easter egg hunt sort of format for them, which is also like nice. So I think that form. And the other thing about like play, in some sense, at least in the ways in which storytelling can happen through play, is that it often doesn't need linearity. And I really like that simultaneity of like this and this, or like we are here now, where do you want to go from here? And so those sort of forms of storytelling that the play allows is also like very freeing for the kinds of things that I want to say.
Right. Right. I'm going to ask if anyone from the audience has any questions. Then they can just, raise their hand and we'll unmute you, or anyone? Wait, Rupali. Okay. Joel, would it be possible for you to give Rupali access to unmute and switch on her video?
Yeah, she's coming.
Yeah.
Hi.
Hi,
Hi, Afra. How are you?
I'm good.
Both of you are wearing grids.
Yeah, came in theme.
Yeah. No, I mean, a really lovely conversation. I just wanted to, Afra, ask you about the last slide, of course, the Dhaka work, but
Yeah,
also the subsequent work after that. Because it seems like even at I mean, a lot of the works I've been to, you sort of you tend to make the space around you as well, like kind of extended from the drawing is also this idea of the three-dimensional space,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
And some of it you work, the last couple of projects you worked with architects.
yeah,
I was just thinking of, probably if you could share, like, what were the conversations, you
yeah,
know, because the points of entry for architectural projects are probably very different. But what would be interesting is to see how your conversations lead to these kind of uh, I mean, I would say three-dimensional drawings, right? They're drawing out
yeah.
from there into a kind of three-dimensional space where it's an embodied way of looking at a drawing. So if you could share some of that.
Totally. And it's such a different process to work with an architect. And then the second level being when the architect and the artist together meet the contractor. Then it's like a whole other fun game because they're like both of you are talking nonsense. Like, please come back. But with this particular project, the Pro Helvetia grant was awarded to me and a Swiss architect together, and was a sort of a collaborative project. And I was kind of interested in Minecraft and this idea of bringing a game object to the real life, and especially in a sort of game which is so much about building. Like I mean, I don't know how many of you ever. Sorry, I'm just gonna get my charger. Yeah, I don't know how many of you ever play Minecraft, but like I would play a lot of the creative mode on Minecraft where, you're not really like in combat or fighting, but you're just building or you're like flying above and watching what other people have built. And there's a certain logic, right? So in Minecraft, you have these equally sized blocks that you can make with, but there's also no gravity. So it's like quite interesting, the possibilities of what you can do. So you can kind of suspend endless, pixels like sort of flying in the air without worrying about like a scaffold or like a base support structure or whatever. And so when Jeremy and I started working on this project first, he wasn't familiar with Minecraft at all. So I thought it would be nice for us to just start building together. So then we just made a realm where we would both hang out in Minecraft a lot, and like we would walk around and see what other people build, but we would also like build different anthills in the game. And so I kind of think that we started thinking in the logic of the game object. And then, of course, when we started kind of translating it into the Dhaka version, that's the one that we were working on, this like question of gravity kept coming up because, for me, like an ideal Minecraft-based anthill would be way more like not only tapering, but also the insides would have like a lot of like stalagmite suspensions of like, different sort of channels and cavities and sort of cave-like nooks, which aren't like really physically possible. And so we would really think about like how much of an extension is possible, how many blocks can you go without support, and then keep kind of trying to redraw that based on like the physics of the real world, I guess. And then there was a tool called Grasshopper, I think, that we ended up using, which was also very easy for us to then translate that logic of drawing. And I could also like kind of take part in that process a bit. But then, of course, we finally like when we ended up sort of taking it to the Dhaka Summit building team, and we had these sort of ideas of what material to use. The one of the ideas of the project was to use with what's available, as in to build with what's available. And because it's boxes at the end of the day, which is quite modular, it lends itself to like different material as it travels. And the sizes of the boxes also could kind of scale up and scale down based on the space and whatever. And in Dhaka, they had this like large amount of metal that they had used for another project, and they kind of had access to it. So we sort of ended up making it with that, and I think it like worked really well for that project. But I think one of our main like learnings, and of course we use mud, which was like really nice because it kind of brought like a different and a more like a very particular, oh, this is the anthill of the Akha sort of feeling to it. And so all of that worked great, but I think the feeling that we both had at the end of that was that it also like used really large amounts of labor. And like how could we kind of think about something that's maybe possible to live on in different ways, even after the install. And so that kind of became quite important to us. So the next project, like the second project, Jamie wasn't involved with, the Zeppelin Museum one. But there again, they had access to canvas cloth because of, like past projects around the Zeppelin and whatever. So then to kind of think of a material like fabric and how that could translate into it, and it was a much smaller space. Um, and there we kind of worked with the museum's internal like scenographic team. But there's like the metal shelves that you have, which have these grooves and hole, like screws and grooves, holes that you can kind of put together. Like sometimes they use it in bookshelves and stuff like that also.
Yeah.
Basically we used that. And so then the size of the anthill got determined by like how many holes, like what was the distance between those holes and what was the length of those kind of rods or whatever. And so then that sort of became the so often I feel like the shape sort of starts getting influenced by the material, which is actually quite an interesting. I mean, I don't mind that process at all, because I feel like also like and sort of build with what's around them in some way, and then that's fine. But the last project that we did was very different, because it was a collaboration with an architecture. I mean, it's the Aachen University, the architecture department of that university, and they have this like building semester where the students are sort of making something as part of their coursework, and then this was the project that they were working on. And so they had certain materials that they were supposed to learn that semester. So we had to sort of design based on those clay bricks that they were working on. So the clay bricks already came in certain sizes or whatever, but also what is realistically a masonry that students can achieve, And so that became like, I was like, Jeremy and I would make some drawings, and then the teachers would look at it and be like, no, 2 weeks, these many students, this is too like, ambitious. This is what's achievable, that's what's achievable. So then the form became something that was like, oh, this is what is possible to build within this project or whatever. Also, then after we kind of designed the project, we decide, I mean, during the process of designing the land that belongs to the state, they kind of agreed that it could be a permanent structure and we didn't have to take it down. So that was really nice, except that those clay bricks were not snow resistant. So then we had to kind of think of some sort of a protection for the anthill. And then everyone was like thinking of roofs, and I was kind of feeling very allergic to this idea of a roof, because I'm like, why does there why is there a roof on this? It's not an anthill anymore, whatever. So then a roofing technique that's sort of indigenous to that region is this sort of these particular kind of thatch roofs. And so we decided to make like a whole other structure, entire, like sort of almost a protective shell in thatch of the anthill, which again we tried to make like as modular as thatch would allow. So they're kind of making like equal strip sizes of thatch that would kind of protect this structure. So from the outside now it no longer looks like this tessellated form, which is why I only shared the like build in progress images. And then when you go inside, you kind of encounter this more like pixel voxel sort of logic of the ant colony. So I feel like the building is so different from the drawing, because it's like real world stuff, right? Like it's and I feel like there's so many more things to consider than like, I think this looks good. Like that isn't always the driving point in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Lovely. I mean, I think what would be nice is if we can invite you to do a workshop probably with the students, and maybe also kind of extend the logic of building to, maybe things that are, like the image itself. I think that's what you try to do also at NMAC, right? Like you kind
Yeah.
of extended, like the drawing itself became the space
Yeah.
where,
Yeah.
which wasn't really
Yeah.
bound, sort of
Yeah, and actually put like this is the, sorry. this is the NMACC space.
Yeah. So gravity somehow does not matter anymore. There are other things that the drawing can actually build as well
And
around.
this particular thing, like this drawing of the space, I've kind of done in many different places in many ways. And I've always like looked at the space and then drawn over the space. And then whatever that is then gets translated into whatever. Like here, they had a pure black box. So it was possible to do this. But there are, like places that I've shown, like in Kochi, when I showed this work, there were like windows and these arches in the room. And like, so then kind of using that into what the grid does in that space, for example.
Right. So you're projecting into that space.
Yeah.
Yeah, lovely. Thanks so much. And hope we can extend this
Yeah,
conversation.
maybe we should play in Minecraft with the students. It'll be really fun.
Yeah, we invite you. Okay. Bye. I'm gonna leave and I'll see
Yeah.
if there are others who want to join. Yeah.
Yeah. And I felt that at the NMECC also, because, like another kind of extension was the room before this room with all the grids in it, where it's essentially the archive is the first thing that you encounter, where you have all these stacks and stacks and stacks of books, and then you're kind of led into, the story of the archive, which is a wholly other space. But they were very connected, very special in that sense. Would anyone else like to ask something? Might have to message and ask to be unmuted. Okay. Okay. I think that's it from our questions and from C this evening. And Afra, thank you so much. I know we tried to get you to Bombay, but it didn't work this time. But we hope you'll come here and you'll visit us as well. And thank you for your time and the talk. And to let everyone know, we'll be meeting again in 2 weeks, where we'll be speaking with Nora Woodker. And so please sign in then as well. And I'll see you. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. See you.
Bye, Afra.